Hello, and welcome to Beating a Dead Horse, where we tell you who lived, who died, and who deserved to die. I'm your host, Sean McKinda.
And I'm your host, Jackson Keller.
This week we watched Dunkirk, the movie that proves Harry Styles does blend in perfectly as a generic white dude. Christopher Nolan is absolutely terrified of drowning in tight spaces, and we still have no idea what Tom Hardy is saying when he wears a mask.
You adapted the war. I was born in it, molded by it. I didn't see the ground until I was already a man.
Ladies and gentlemen, Tom Hardy. But yeah, I like this movie well enough, but I think overall it had some serious problems. But unfortunately, I'm very much in the minority on that one, or fortunately, depending on how you want to look at it. I think it's just a...
Don't want to be going along with those sheeple, praising their latest Inception flick.
I'm my own. I don't like Christopher Nolan. No, that's not true. I like Christopher Nolan quite a bit. I can't even lie to you. I'm sorry. I liked a lot of his direction in this, and I think he did a very nice job overall. I just have some sticking points that affect me personally, and I mean, even my pre-discussion with Jackson kind of kicked back that I'm more alone in this than I think I am. But there were some issues in it that hampered my enjoyment of it, and I don't really want to get into them quite yet, just because they are core plot mechanics. So
pretty central to the way death is treated, just based on our pre-discussion. I would say kind of what problems you had with this movie.
Yeah.
Speaking only for myself, I didn't expect to enjoy this movie as much as I did, actually. Both kind of from the first... It took me a little while to get into it. Like, maybe the first, 15 minutes, I was kind of like, I don't know if I'm into this. But, and especially from the previews, didn't really look that appealing to me at all. It seemed kind of just...
I saw the preview for this movie 6 times. The theater I go to see it at played it before every one of their movies, and I saw Wonder Woman in 70mm, so we got the extended trailer of this, which was another 5 minutes of it. So by the time I actually got around to seeing this movie, I had felt like I had seen the entire thing already. I was exhausted. Well, I mean, this might actually be why I don't like it, so I guess take everything I say with a grain of salt.
True story, when I suggested that we go see this, his first reaction was like a groan. And he was like, you're right. Like, it's probably good material for it, but goddamn, if I haven't seen that trailer a million times, I just don't want anything to do with it now.
I was so done with it. There came a point where I would go see it with my friend who could quote half of the trailer just because we had seen it so many times. It was ridiculous. It was ridiculous.
Big marketing push, I guess you could say. And I think the fact that you felt like you had seen the movie from the trailer is kind of an interesting point, in that in some ways it's sort of hard to disagree, just because it's so much more about a mood and a feeling as opposed to any kind of central character, which ended up being something those normally I like my movies character driven normally. It's very much unlike his other work in a lot of ways. You think about a Christopher Nolan movie, you think about a tortured grizzled man kind of giving a big speech about some sort of thematic concept. It just insert any speech from The Dark Knight here, even Inception. There's a lot of that, but they, despite whatever criticisms you can level at his dialogue, his movies do tend to be
highly enjoyable,
and fairly character driven. Which is definitely not what this movie was. It was a change of pace for him in a lot of ways, and so it wasn't my favorite Christopher Nolan movie by a long shot, but I do think that the more it kind of sits with me, the more I end up appreciating it thematically, and also I think just the experience of seeing it in the theater was really tense, really enjoyable. I mean, I think for what this movie wants to do, I think it does it very well. I wouldn't, like, if you have, like, really terrible anxiety or claustrophobia, like, I would not recommend someone like that go see this movie, because it felt,
Oh my God, this touched on some of like my genuine fears of death. Some of the ways, and I'm not going to say anything yet, but some of the ways people die in this movie made me so viscerally uncomfortable while I was watching it. Props to Christopher Nolan, but I was uncomfortable in my seat just because he took my two biggest phobias and just went, hey, here you go. Enjoy your anxiety attack. I got you.
yeah, the action in this movie isn't fun like in something like Inception. Like Inception, you got like the twisting like hallways and like the things folding in on themselves and like big like screechy car chases and like Tom Hardy doing a silly quip with a grenade launcher. And the action in this is pretty understated in a lot of ways, and focus a lot more on kind of that feeling, that anxiety. So if you are one of those people who is kind of like highly susceptible to, like a movie giving you that kind of anxiety, I would not recommend you go see Dunkirk. Otherwise, though, if you do plan on seeing it, I would say definitely see it in the theater. Don't wait for it to go on Netflix. It's going to lose a lot of its punch, I think, without kind of the big cinematic experience.
I agree with what you've said here. I think it's definitely a movie that's worth seeing in theater, and I still recommend that you go see it. It was a good movie regardless of my criticisms with it. I regret, actually, I really regret not seeing it in 70 millimeter. I have a theater by me that shows 70 millimeter films, and as I said, I saw Wonder Woman in it. I didn't see this one in it, and I really wish I had. I think 70 millimeter would have been an awesome add-on to it. It would have worked well, is basically what I'm saying.
Yeah, well, this is one of the things that's great about Nolan, is that he's kind of one of the last big budget auteurs that like can do what he wants, and like they'll let him get away with it just because his movies, he like Tarantino, like this isn't a new observation, but he's like one of the few directors that are consistently putting out like original work, original screenplays, not based on like a license, and they're getting a lot of money to do what they want because they make that money back and they're good at their jobs. So that's, and I think it would have been great to see it in like 70 millimeter because those guys like, Nolan, Tarantino, they tend to be big proponents of film. I certainly would have liked to see it that way, but of course I live out in like the hinterlands in the middle of nowhere, so that wasn't exactly an option. Regardless, I still think that I know that Nolan, I didn't even read, it was some like clickbait title. I'm sure like the quote was somewhat taken out of context, but like Nolan was talking about how like Netflix is like ruining the theater experience or whatever. I'm sure that that's like an out of context quote.
Oh,
but,
yeah, 100%. It has to be.
But with regards to Dunkirk, like yes, absolutely. Like you can tell that he wanted this movie to be seen in theaters and like really took advantage of the kind of what the format of film and like the whole cinematic experience has to offer to kind of make this movie. I think before we move into the death discussion, because it's a war film, there's a lot of death and it's kind of hard to discuss the movie in any sort of detail without talking about it. That kind of brings me to the last thing I wanted to say more generally, and that one of my fears was that it was just going to be kind of a generic war movie. And, based on our pre-discussion, maybe you feel a little bit differently about this, but I certainly felt like it had a lot more to offer than just kind of your typical war movie. I mean, I didn't think that it ended up being... I think it did some things a little differently that elevated it a bit for me.
Now, the funny thing is that I agree with you that this is not your typical war movie. And despite what I might have led you to believe, I think the fact that it isn't your typical war movie works against it. I like that it's not your typical war movie, but I do think it causes some rifts that your typical war movie doesn't have. So, with that in mind, let's slide right into that spoiler territory and kind of give a little bit of an in-depth analysis as to why and how death has shaped that. So, the big thing through this movie is that unlike your usual war movie where it is set up and you watch a couple of army guys or what have you go through situations and live or die in said situations, in this movie we see 3 separate storylines all converging at different points. So our first storyline is with Harry Styles and his renegade soldier. And we see that we're told that it's at the mole and we're given a time of 1 week. Following that, we see Tom Hardy's pilot character and we are given the air and told that it is 1 day. Finally, we see Old Man Sea Captain and we are told that it is the sea and we're told 1 hour. And we're left to kind of parse out what these times mean, at least in the beginning. You catch on relatively fast, but you are kind of left in the dark for a little bit. And so it establishes that this is when everyone meets. 1 week for Harry Styles, 1 day for Tom Hardy, and 1 hour for Sea Captain McSea Captain. I'm going to say this right now, is most of these characters don't actually have names, so pardon the fact that we're probably going to be making up names as we go along.
Making up names referring to the actors when like they're familiar. The only name I can readily recall is that the boy who is not the sea captain's son, but the brown-haired boy, his name is George. That's the only one that stuck with me.
All right, so we have George at least. Yeah. But, as I was saying, there's this whole time motif. And behind that time motif is this constant ticking clock. Literally, it's a sound effect of a ticking clock. It's represented throughout every tense scene in adding both tension to the scene as well as continuing along with the motif of time. Now, the problem I have with this literal ticking clock is it becomes very manipulative in my eyes because it takes away from the inherent danger and risk in the situations and creates a element of, I don't want to say time, but an element of tension, like we're leading towards something. And a lot of times it pays off as nothing. And about halfway through the movie, I got real sick of it and just ready for it to stop. I want either a payoff or I want the ticking to stop because it doesn't feel, it lost that tension to me, and it kind of dawned on me that it felt more manipulative because this is not a character-driven story. This is a story based around the events. So to have this constant ticking is to create tension and empathy for these characters that are cutouts. There's nothing to them. We just are nervous for them because we have that constant ticking, that slow encroaching doom that we are positive is coming. And when it kept not coming, it lost a lot for me.
So the ticking clock, I very much enjoyed the ticking clock. And I think
hot takes,
that's probably one you won't hear. Like the central like gimmick of the movie, of this well-received, praised movie, is something that Jackson Keller enjoys. But I very much enjoyed it. I never got sick of it. I never thought it was distracting or overly manipulative, perhaps precisely because it was less of a character-driven story, and that I think that this was much more of a mood piece, much more dedicated to theme, than kind of having any particular character arc. Like, it feels a lot of stuff in this movie that you might normally criticize another movie for doing is kind of like sloppy or lazy, feels very much intentional to kind of help either bring this sense of anxiety or helplessness or kind of tie into one of the few like central themes of the movie about kind of heroism and survival, and just a couple of things. And I suppose going forward, I would like to mention that a lot of my thoughts on this movie that I had been having were sort of said in a much smarter way by film critic Hulk, who wrote an extended essay on not just Dunkirk, but all of Christopher Nolan's movies, and kind of how this anxiety of time is a recurring theme throughout all his work. And it's a very good essay. We'll link it.
Yeah, there's going to be a link in the description below.
Yeah, so if what I'm saying might sound a little familiar, but only because I think he was expressing a lot of ideas that I had sort of rolling around in my head after seeing it. And so I think that this is one of those movies where I don't even want to call him the main character, but at least the main character of the mole section, Harry Styles' character, it feels like he's the kind of character, he feels almost like a player character in like a Call of Duty game, like just something, just a cipher for the player to inhabit, except in this case, of course, it's like the viewer. And normally, in movies at least, in games it's kind of a case-by-case basis, but normally, in movies I'm very much in Sean's corner. Like, I want a character, I want kind of a meaty arc with a distinctive personality, I want all that stuff. And so I think that I'd be a lot more inclined to agree that the ticking clock was maybe a little manipulative, maybe even a little like corny, if it was doing that in addition to kind of a more traditional character arc, where like Harry Styles like realizes a lesson about like his own cowardice or something. But it's not really doing that, and so much of the movie is just like him running around trying to survive. And I think that the ticking clock, by calling attention to that, is sort of drawing my mind more to like the thematic importance of what's going on, because it's kind of inherently an artificial construction, right? It's drawing your attention to kind of the soundtrack. It's really, for me, it really emphasizes like Hans Zimmer's score, which I think is, doing really great work. It emphasizes kind of the rhythm. It made me honestly think a little bit of Baby Driver, in that it made you draw more attention to the sound in a way that other films might not do so. So I think just in terms of like creating this anxiety, kind of that rhythm helped give the individual bombs, the individual shots, the clanging of metal. I think it all really emphasized that, which went a long way into making those scenes that are really like, that really grab you, like when the hulls of ships are like filling with water, and like there's that really brutal moment where after the oil in the water ignites, after the ship is bombed, he's like keeping his head under the water and like he can't breathe, but he knows that like if he goes up he's gonna like start burning alive, and it's horrible. And I think in those moments, just by kind of drawing attention to the soundtrack, it emphasizes that really visceral feeling, because I'm not worrying so much about what they're saying. And I think this is an area where I honestly like don't even know if it was deliberate this time, but I know a common problem in Christopher Nolan's movies is that you often can't hear the fucking dialogue over like, Hans Zimmer's like thundering like score or whatever. Like I know it took like several watches of like Inception and The Dark Knight to like figure out what some characters are saying in certain scenes. Like his sound mixing has been consistently bad, especially in The Dark Knight Rises where you have like Bane. That's a whole other issue. But point is, in this movie, it feels a lot more deliberate in that the dialogue doesn't matter so much. It ends up almost becoming kind of this part of this background noise. And just really trying to get you to really focus on kind of the physical action, that primal fear that kind of comes with trying to survive when you're boxed in and there's nowhere to go.
And see, I would be inclined to agree with you, and I'm still somewhat inclined to agree with you, but you made the point that there's not really characters in the movie. But there's 2 or 3 definitive arcs. Because we do have Harry Styles' renegade soldier coming to the realization that he is a coward. You use that specifically as an example that we don't see that. But we do. That's the final shot of the movie, is his realization. So he does have an arc.
Is he a coward, though? I don't think that was the point the movie was trying to make.
He's a deserter. That's the whole thing. Is he's deserting Dunkirk and he's trying to get away, and so he sneaks onto every boat and tries to escape there, and at the end is Churchill's speech about the brave soldiers who are remaining and fighting, and his realization that he should still be over there, that that's what he is, but he left.
I didn't read it that way. I read it because we see that like he's definitely not the most cowardly character in the whole movie. And like he actually, in the scene with the Frenchman. Oh, what is his name? This guy has a name too that he stole. But throughout the movie he kind of is palling around with this French guy that like wants to get away and be part of the like British retreat. But like
palling around is a bit strong.
But yeah, palling around is maybe not the correct way to put that. But they're kind of following each other. They're kind of together for the whole movie, and then it's revealed, like, you know, he's French and not part of the British Army, and like he's just trying to do what he has to like get away and survive too. I don't think the movie is that interested in condemning them for what they did in kind of this physical like heat of the moment to try and like get away from like be in this kind of hopeless situation. I think that like, because and this is where I'm going to steal from Hulk's article, in that like survival, you survived and that's enough, because we get that those moments where like after they're coming back from the defeat and like the guy handing them like food, like he can't look them in the eye. I don't think we're supposed to be sympathizing with that guy.
See, it's hard to say, because there's that final stinger at the end of Harry Styles looking at the camera all like with the realization, and maybe I totally missed what the realization should be, but he even references Old Man Sea Captain not looking at him in the eye and looking at everybody else. It's totally possible that I'm completely missing what his arc was, and that it wasn't supposed to be that he was a coward, but I still feel like there was some sort of arc there, at least intended to be.
Yes. I mean, there's definitely like a realization that the character has, or but I guess now that I'm thinking about it, the movie is also a little bit at odds with itself in terms of this sort of issue of cowardice, kind of thinking about the other two strands, because then you have Cillian Murphy's character, who gets picked up by the boat captain, and you know he is very much presented as being like like a coward, so much so that
Well,
he
no, it's being defended as shell shock, not so much a coward. Like, they make that very clear.
at the beginning, but then like look at his his actions like lead to this like completely unnecessary death of this boy. And he walks off like he doesn't even know that George died at the end of the movie. Like he just walks off and just kind of treating everything as like fine. So I don't think we're entirely supposed to. I think certainly the movie is much more judgmental of his character than Harry Styles' character.
Well, I mean, even if we want to play that judgment there, we still get tension around the boat surviving, and there's basically, as we're kind of derailed from the subject at hand of how is death handled and more on how her character is handled in this, my point was mainly that when you make a movie about war and then kind of introduce half characters and then add what I felt to be a false tension, a manipulation through this literal ticking clock, it creates empathy for characters and hopes that they survive that you might not have otherwise had. And I think that kind of hurt the movie in my eyes, and it irritated me that we continually had it. And that's really my final point on it, is that I don't think it worked for me the way it worked for so many other people.
Yeah, and I guess just in defense of it, I do kind of want to come back to this issue of cowardice, because I do think that like how people are reacting in the face of death is very important. But kind of just sort of before we leave the director's choice of the ticking clock behind, I think that what I think it's almost, for me, it almost did the opposite in that the fact that it was so present like all the time, even in scenes where nobody died, the fact that it kept coming back, I think helped emphasize that, again, just helped create that feeling. And I think what also played into that was the disposability of characters. And especially like in the mole section, like it's, we pointed out in the intro that there are a lot, Harry Styles in particular kind of fades to the background because there are a lot of like dark-haired white boys in this movie. But like he had to be aware of that like so much of his crowd like looked the same. And like, sure, it's, 1940s, like World War II, like Britain, it's not going to be the most like diverse army in the world. But like, you could have thrown a few blondes in there. You could have had some ginger soldiers running around. But I think like the fact that everyone looked the same and like you can't really tell at a glance like who died, I think that was part of the point. And I think that it really it was really trying to tap into something like making us not think of it so much on like an intellectual level, which is normally like how we engage with Nolan movies. Like they get the I think the kind of unfair criticism a lot of the time that they're kind of like pseudo intellectual, have a lot of like philosophical like diatribes that like don't really mean anything. And in those other Nolan movies, like whether I think there's more to them than that, but like those speeches, the speechifying is definitely calling your attention to the themes. I think this was Nolan like making us really wanting to pare down like that sort of understanding on like an intellectual level, and really trying to give us that like primal feeling of anxiety. And I don't think that would have worked as well for me if I was completely certain of who had died and when and at what time. And that like I remember people's deaths more than I remember them, and it ends up kind of hanging over the movie like a big old cloud. And I think that like you never, I think that without the ticking clock, the danger of taking it out is that you maybe let the I think you would lose that feeling that like nobody is ever safe.
No, I really liked what he did. Originally, when I first walked out of this theater, I thought that his usage of Harry Styles was really frustrating to me, and that I could never tell who was alive, who was dead. And part of that, because I didn't realize this till I left the theater, that ticking clock stinger might have been more irritating to me because I was constantly wondering, wait, did he die? Is that part just over now? So it was, I liked it a lot now that I understand that it was an idea of losing Harry Styles in the crowd and not necessarily knowing who's alive and dead. There were any number of times that I was positive that he was the one who died. When he was trapped under the water, I thought that was Harry Styles. When we saw dead bodies floating in, positive one of them was Harry. There's just a lot of people that look like him, and it worked horribly well to emphasize just the slaughter that was happening and the faceless masses that the army had become across the board. It was a brilliant move, and it, as you said, it has to be assumed intentional, because no one in their right mind would be able to watch that for the first time and say, all right, I followed him perfectly the whole time. It's not possible. So let's assume it was intentional, because I like giving him credit for that one.
The other thing, too, about the ticking clock element and this issue of him getting lost in the crowd and kind of his disposability, I think the other thing it's doing is emphasizing those three strands, making you think about time. And because a lot of the times where we would see Harry Styles, or not see Harry Styles, we would see like another faceless soldier, and I would think that it's Harry Styles. I would think that it was him. It would be during those moments in like the boat section, so, not as much in Tom Hardy's plane parts, because he's so much, kind of a little more disconnected from the rest. Or at least until the end, like that he kind of comes in and saves the day. But like during the boat sections, like I mentioned earlier, the guy who burned to death in the oil, like I thought that was him. I like for a hot minute, and having that removal, knowing that we're watching Harry Styles go through like a week in advance, seeing these other sections with all these dead brown-haired white boys, and wondering if that's where it's all going to end up. At the end of his little story, if we're going to get to the end of it, and he's just another body floating by the captain's ship. And I think in that sense, it worked really well. I think...
Yeah, I'm going to give that one to you. I really like the way the stories converge, and I liked the constant watching for his body, just because you felt like it was coming. And so I enjoyed that part. Enjoyed is not the word, but I was impressed by that constant eyes open, especially because once you realize what's happening, you are on the constant lookout for the bodies of the other individuals and trying to find where this is going to converge and where it's all gonna go down.
Yep, like the moment where, not just for Harry Styles, but for everyone, it's a pretty hopeless situation. Everyone's completely boxed in. And I think what makes that, maybe sort of shifting gears a little bit, I think the one part of the movie that didn't work so well for me, that didn't have that tension, was the Tom Hardy thread. Just because Tom Hardy himself is a lot more distinctive than Harry Styles, even behind a mask. Very charismatic screen presence. And he seemed more like a named character, but he didn't really have a name. He didn't really have much more of a character, but he was kind of treated like one. And I never felt the same tension, even though in theory, we have that element of him writing down how much fuel he thinks he has left, and calling in to his partner and asking where he's at on fuel. So you have a more explicit ticking clock element with him, but I never quite felt that same sort of tension. And I think part of that might have been somewhat of the lack of overlap. It felt like Tom Hardy was a lot more in his own little world, and it felt like a lot of the time his world just consisted of shooting down other planes without kind of that frenetic pace. It felt a lot more even, like he's lining up shots. Those were the moments of the movie where I felt like that fear of death that I enjoyed about the rest of it, or I guess more specifically about the mole stuff, because the boat's kind of got another feeling on its own. But I guess until Tom Hardy felt like he was there more for the purpose of the plot, to come in and shoot down a plane, and he kind of saves the day a little bit.
I think he did kind of double duty though too. Not only was he there for the plot, I think he kind of worked as a breathing moment for the rest of the movie, because his scenes were, set in the sky, so it was very brightly lit, it was bright blue, there was an underlying tension to it, but it never had the same outward tension. I never really was worried that he was going to die. I was more just happy for the breath of fresh air, so to speak, because the tension would immediately lower in those situations, so I could sit back and, not gonna lie, enjoy watching Tom Hardy fly an airplane because he's a charming motherfucker.
I mean, we're always going to enjoy watching Tom Hardy do anything because he's amazing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, while it might not necessarily have thematically fit as well, I think it did a nice job of just breaking down some of that tension that's built up over the past 20 minutes of just death.
And I can get behind that, but I think, speaking of kind of the boatman scenes, kind of the third thread, I think that also, a lot of the time, did a lot of the same stuff, in that there was a little more brightly colored, less dingy and gray than on the Mole and in kind of the bottoms of these ships. Had kind of fresh-faced, more distinctive-looking boys, and the old man, and kind of this charming little boat. But I think what I like about those scenes better, as breathers, is that in those breathing moments, it felt like there was still stuff happening. I wasn't completely clenching at the thought of them getting bombed out of the sky, bombed from above at any moment. But I also, with Tom Hardy's sections, it was less of a break for me, and those are the sections of the movie where I started to check out, which is something that I don't think you ever want anyone to do in a movie. And because I was okay, I'm not really feeling the tension, there isn't much going on in terms of dialogue or theme, we'll just watch Tom Hardy fly a plane. Whereas with the boat scenes, you still got a bit of a break because they're not quite as intense, but there were a lot more. That's where you kind of get the more Nolan discussions going in. The boat captain is kind of talking to the boys about patriotism and duty, and it's kind of introducing some ideas that they'll touch on later. And then, even though it's not as intense, they get Cillian Murphy on the boat, and that creates more conflict. And I think, then it pays off a lot more when they get to the danger, and they now, after spending the first half of the movie just kind of having these discussions and moving forward and kind of having this light, and there's still that sense of dread, I think, this light sense of dread that's just not quite as overwhelming, but it's still there. And I didn't feel that in the Tom Hardy plane sections. And I guess because I guess if you think about where all those arcs are going, you have both vehicles heading towards the same destination. They're going into the danger, but for Tom Hardy, he's kind of doing the same thing in every scene. He's shooting down enemies, keeping track of his fuel.
He's also literally and figuratively above the danger. We never see his character being tailed by another plane. He's always doing the tailing, which, I mean, barring the first point when he gets grazed and loses his fuel gauge, it's always very much a chasing, not being chased. So you don't have that tension. I do think the reason it might exist, though, outside of the boat, though, is that the boat continues to be a big part of just death. Despite being lighter than Dunkirk, it still has a large, overwhelming feeling of death just because of what is happening with Cillian Murphy and George, who gets knocked down some stairs by Cillian Murphy, breaks his head on a metal pipe of some sort, and ultimately dies. It the whole time still feels very tense and unpleasant for obvious reasons and for obvious intentions. It's a dark moment of death outside of the war and just more of a civilian casualty through circumstance than through the actual war. But even in Tom Hardy's scenes, we don't get anything like that, so it still allows for a little bit of a more levity. Although I will say I am kind of coming around to, I did check out a little bit during those scenes because it was just him shooting down planes, and as enjoyable as that was, it wasn't necessarily super pertinent to anything. I guess I can see why they had it there because the enemy planes played a central role, and for them to just get shot down by a Deus Ex Machina a couple times would be kind of uncomfortable and out of the blue. But
I don't know. I think that would have added to the chaotic feeling that it's kind of out of their hands and all they can do is run.
I would like to kind of touch on something else just kind of that I generally noticed about the way injuries and death was handled in this movie. And I don't know whether this was in an attempt to get it into the PG-13 range or if it was an intentional decision. Either way, I actually really like this, is that the only times we see blood in the movie are on the injured, not the dead. We see George bleeding lightly from the head. We never get any sort of grievous amounts of blood not pouring out of the back of his skull as people weep over him. It's just a very understated amount of blood. We see some bullet wounds with bandages that have blood on them. We never get at one point a character gets shot in the hand, I believe, but we don't get any blood from that. We just get it happening and pulled away. We watch people get bombed. We watch people get burned. And it's all very understated and bloodless. And I like that a lot because it detached from the gore fest it could have been. It didn't feel like it took away from that death for death's sake and became much more of a death for realism's sake. At no point did it feel like a death was extraneous or just there for show. It felt like each one had a point, and I think the fact that it was so bloodless really helped with that. I think that had there actually been blood, or at one point a bunch of people get bombed, and had we seen limbs or something like that, it would have been so out of character for the movie and just set a totally different tone, almost a humorous one. I mean, that's kind of a disturbing thing to say, but I think it would have been a slightly humorous tone had we seen more gore from this movie. And I like that it wasn't there. It was very understated deaths. And I appreciate that, and I thought that worked really well.
The other thing I love about the understated deaths, I think you're completely right. I was thinking about the lack of blood as well. One, I think it really, in a weird way, that the fact that one of the only instances of blood that I can bring to mind is George and his little bit of bleeding from the head. I think that put some emphasis on what otherwise is a really understated, just like really senseless death. And the other thing the lack of blood does is that it really emphasizes the soundtrack. And I think that that's one of the reasons I was so drawn to the ticking clock and like everything else, just the way everything sounded. Because what made you jump in this movie, what really sticks with you is that sound of like a bullet, like the one that missed you and, you know, got some other poor bastard that's like standing right next to you, that like a few seconds ago, if you had been slightly to the left, would have been you. I think it really emphasizes the sound as kind of this punctuation of death. And I think what it also does is for the moments that are really brutal, it makes them so much more brutal. Like in the ship, in the hull of the ship, when they're trying to like plug up the holes of the water and that guy gets shot in the eye and you just hear him scream and you can't see it because he's covering it up, but your stomach just turns, or at least mine did.
See, I like what you're saying here quite a bit, because I hadn't looked at it from an audio visual side of things, because initially we get gunfire and almost every shot we watch somebody die with it. As they're running through the streets of Dunkirk, we watch people get shot, and every time it's shot, somebody dies. So initially, and this is reinforced throughout the movie, for a chunk of time, we get a death for nearly every bullet. And we get, at least what I would imagine, is almost a Pavlovian response of, bang, oh, somebody else just bit it. It might not be the guy we saw, but someone bit it, even if we don't see them die. So we hear, it becomes this matter of anytime there's gunfire, anytime there's bombs, something like that, someone has died. And the exception to that is in the boat, as the boat's being used for target practice, but that's a slightly different situation unto itself. It does underscore, though, on the big sweeping scenes, someone has died. Someone is no longer part of this battle, part of this world. And I think the soundtrack is very effective. I'm not going to beat around that bush. I just don't like the clock.
I think regarding that boat scene, one of the things that makes it so great is that the bullet sounds still mean an incoming death, but just in a different way. A slower death, a worse death, because that's sort of the beginning of the end for the French character Gibson, I believe, is the name that he stole. And we start hearing that, and that's when we know, like, in our souls that, like, not everyone in that boat is going to make it out. There's no way. And it just starts filling with water, and, like, the sounds of rushing water just, like, keep adding onto that until it finally, the tension is finally released in a really, really small way. When you just see Gibson, you can hardly tell that it's him. Again, another brown-haired white guy. You have to really, like, look in the other scenes to try and find him and figure out that it was him. It just kind of floats away, and, like, that's the end of him. And I guess the fact that I really appreciate that for the most part, the named characters in this movie, the ones that we do have our eyes, like, drawn to, all of their deaths are really understated, and I think it makes them not like glorious, not something that they don't get that big moment where they, like, like a bunch of other war movies where they step into some incoming enemy fire and hold them off so everyone can get away. Like, the deaths aren't heroic in this film.
With, and this is important, the notable exception of George, who gets his name on the front page of paper as a hero. And he's not a soldier. Unlike many war movies where soldiers are given the hero's treatment, in this movie it's the boy who quietly lost his life by accident that is treated as the hero for what he has done. And I like that. I like that now that I'm thinking about it. I really should stop giving my opinions in the beginning of these because it's like almost always changed by the end.
Well, you can't help. Sometimes when you're talking about a film, it brings up other points that you hadn't considered. And I think regarding George, I think the other layer that I like about it is I'm gonna refer to Hulk here and kind of drawing from briefly from another Nolan movie, Inception. How the catharsis of that movie, to leave it kind of vague in case like you haven't seen it, but if you have, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. The main catharsis of like the ultimate dream heist. The way that's resolved is with a lie. Like, it's a lie to make someone feel good, but it's not true. And I think that he's doing kind of a similar thing with George here. And it's not the lie isn't that George was heroic. He most certainly was. Like, he isn't a soldier, just got on that boat and was ready to go help people. But the unfortunate kind of lie is that his death was totally meaningless and that he didn't really end up helping anyone. That poor boy didn't have to die. And I think that the action of the son, the blonde-haired boy, getting him in the paper, to me, that's less of a true hero being celebrated and more of someone just trying to make something completely senseless have some kind of meaning, just really like reaching out for it. And like, he doesn't tell, like, Cillian Murphy's character doesn't even know that, like, because of his cowardice that that George died. And just it feels kind of like a desperate, like, really hopeful sort of lie. And that was it was heartwarming in that it felt like that action had a lot of meaning for the son, for the blonde-haired boy, but also really tragic. And I think it really emphasizes just how sad and meaningless that George's death was. I don't know. I after seeing, after thinking about this in the context of kind of his broader work and thinking about kind of those emotional lies, it's something that I was kind of wondering about with the ending of this movie in general, just because it's the only point in the movie that really gestures towards kind of the typical war movie tropes in the big heroic finish and all that good stuff. Tom Hardy kind of landing the plane and surrendering, and him coming in for the big victory. Churchill's speech in the background with the swelling, the more typical like swelling music, and it just made me think like how much of this movie is about heroism versus like the narrative of heroism, if you know what I mean. Like making something terrible sound like it was meaningful and important. Like, how is the importance of Churchill's speech not that the British army was cowardly for escaping, but trying to spin that narrative that their escape in itself was important and heroic. How important was that? And I don't know, it's something I guess I keep thinking about.
Yeah, because we see George celebrated as a hero in his paper, despite being a senseless, meaningless death. And we see Tom Hardy presumably taken to be captured, executed, something, but we hear nothing more from him. And the character Harry Styles escapes with his life in a very middle of the road type of escape, essentially, and is met with a middle of the road type of resolution. It's kind of taking the standard chart, flipping it, and I don't know, it's kind of telling a different story with it.
Yeah, I think it's the kind of movie that makes me, now that I know what the ending is emphasizing, like, makes me want to go through it again, thinking about that stuff in particular, just because my first reaction when I came out of the theater was that it felt like the inspiring music, the more typical war stuff, felt a lot more earned than in a lot of other movies. But at the same time, like, is that just the lie I'm being sold? Like, just the nice narrative catharsis to what was otherwise just 2 hours of tragic, senseless death. I don't know, but I think the ending of the movie, despite seeming pretty typical on the surface, I think is working in some pretty complex ways. And yeah, it left a pretty big impression on me. And speaking of endings, looks like this is where we wrap up.
Thanks for listening. This has been our discussion on Dunkirk. I'm Sean McKinda. You can find me on Twitter at Sean_McKinda. You can also find me on Twitch. I stream every Wednesday. Right now I'm doing BeamNG. And just goofing some cars right up. Go over to twitch.tv/helpless_Skippy.
And I'm Jackson Keller. You can find me over on Twitter at JacksonJKeller. I hang out on Twitter a lot, and that's pretty much it. Otherwise, I live on a mountain.
Special thanks goes out to Lords of the Highway for the use of our theme song. It is Suicide Alternative Take off the album High Octane Low Expectations. Great album. It's on Spotify. Go take a listen. Spread the word. And while you're spreading that word, let them know about us. We're really operating purely on word of mouth at this point, so tell people that you like this podcast. Point them to the direction. Leave us a review on iTunes. It helps out a great deal in terms of getting our name out there, and we really would appreciate that. Also, you can go like us on Facebook and Twitter at BADH_cast. Next week, we're going to be talking about Atomic Blonde, so go watch it and tune in.
You have your homework.
And the clock is ticking down.
The call went out. We have to go to Dunkirk.
Don't you go into the ground. Don't you go.